Bible in a minute, Leviticus chapter 1. Buckle up because the next 7 chapters are all about the sacrificial system. In this chapter, we have instructions for burnt offerings, specifically a bull, sheep, goat, pigeon, or turtle dove, poor animals, and it's interesting to note that you just can't bring any animal. Like if you catch a rabbit or a fish or something, those won't work. Why? Because it's not a sacrifice if it doesn't cost you something. So their sacrifice has to come from their herd or their flock, and not just an animal they caught in the world around them. Now later in 2 Samuel 24, we'll hear this echoed. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. Because a sacrifice? Well, it cost you something. That's kind of the point.
Leviticus 2. Try to contain yourselves because this chapter finally lets us learn about the rules and regulations behind grain offering. To hopefully jazz up this chapter a bit, it's interesting to consider the process for the memorial offering, a special bit of the offering that was intentionally burned to create an aroma pleasing to the Lord. But it was less about like some deity thinking that it just smelled nice. Yahweh may or may not have been a Target bestie or the essential oils type, but the point behind this was memorial. The smell was to waft into the air, a scent pleasingly evoking memories of the good that God had done. The sense of smell is very connected to our long-term memory builder in our brain. That's why we love the smell of baking cookies or fresh sheets, or for some of you weirdos, gasoline. It's me. I'm some of you. I used to have a bread maker active on Communion Sundays for exactly this reason. Smell is a quick way to better times in the past. See? Grain offerings chapter wasn't so bad. Worst case, you're imagining the smell of bread. Best case, fresh cookies. Even better case, the gas pump. It's not weird.
Leviticus chapter 3. This chapter has the instructions for a peace offering, and it's generally the same bloody instructions as the chapters around it with one unique addition. At the end of verse 16, it says, all fat is the Lord's. I feel like that would make a great t-shirt. Anyone else? Now, on its surface, this line is simply referring to the fact that the fat from the animals was to be burned and become smoke, while the meat could be distributed to the priests and the people to eat, but not me. I'm a vegetarian. However, going a bit deeper, scholars see this as what is likely the first addition by the Holiness Code in this series of chapters by the priestly code. Let me explain. Leviticus is made up from 2 priestly sources. The priestly code, holiness is limited to the sanctuary. And the holiness code, it's coextensive with the promised land. In the priestly code, the doctrine of holiness is static, and in the holiness code, it's dynamic. And so this phrase, all fat is the Lord's, could be seen as a move beyond one particular sacrifice and a statement about the expansive nature of what belongs to God.
Leviticus chapter 4, dog walking edition. Say hi, buddy. This chapter is speaking to a very specific group of people about what to do when they unintentionally do something, aka sin, and even speaks to priests about what they should do. Now, I don't know that I've heard very many clergy people speak about their own sin and what they do, but in this ancient theological context, they are offering that you give the best of your best. In this instance, it's food, it's animal sacrifice, it's the most expensive thing you got. So how do we interpret that for today, particularly in a context where people are deviating from the moral compass, won't acknowledge it, and giving us whiplash trying to keep up with the double standard? Now, I can't speak for all of society, but just talking to you and me for a minute, we know when we are operating outside of our own moral code and the covenant that we have the divine. In a world that seems hell-bent on excusing any and all wrongdoing, let's model what it looks like to own our mistakes and work to make it right.
Leviticus chapter 5. Did you know it's a sin to not speak up when you hear a public charge to testify? If you've seen something or learned something and you don't speak up, you're held responsible. If you touch anything unclean, an animal, a person, and you become aware of it, you're guilty and must confess your sin. As a penalty for sin, you are to bring a female lamb or goat as an offering, and the priest will make atonement on your behalf. If the lamb is too expensive for you, that's okay. You can bring 2 pigeons or 2 doves, and you will be forgiven. If you can't bring the birds, you can bring a portion of the best flour. The priest will make atonement on your behalf, and you will be forgiven. There are more precise details on making an offering in this chapter, but what I hope you'll remember is that 4 times the writer says after the offering, you will be forgiven. You will be forgiven. You will be forgiven. You will be forgiven. Let that sink in.
Leviticus 6. I was sitting in a coffee shop recently, and there was a painted piece of wood on the wall that said, if you're looking for a sign, this is it. I love a good witty sign, but I also thought, how many lives must have been altered because they saw that little piece of wood? To get a reminder that you're worthy, you're loved, take the leap. In Leviticus 6, we learn a couple things. 1, if we're feeling guilty because we've lied or defrauded or just accidentally come across something that doesn't belong to us, we should pay it back. plus a little bit more, and bring an offering to the temple for God's forgiveness. The chapter also outlines a number of other burnt offerings that we can give in the temple for forgiveness. And that burnt offering would burn 24/7 within the community, creating a pillar of smoke that could constantly be seen, so that no matter where people were in their lives as they went along their day, they were constantly and always reminded that they're loved and forgiven.
Leviticus chapter 7. All right, we made it to the last of the instructions on all the different kinds of offerings. There's the burnt offering, the grain offering, the purification offering, the guilt offering, the offering of ordination, and the sacrifice of well-being. That last one, in addition to some further instructions, is what we find here in chapter 7. Don't eat any fat or blood, burn any meat that touches something unclean, which means more than just falling onto the floor and into the dirt, but rather the whole clean-unclean dichotomy that they had going on regarding animals and people and whatnot. And if you do eat any, well, then you're cut off. And yes, it can be easy to read all this blood and guts and killing and sacrifice as quite primitive, but really what we're seeing is the codification of ritual and liturgy. Because a community is more than just people, it's the things that those people do together. And while we might have a bit less blood in our rituals today, we still have rituals, and we still need them to remind us who we are and what it means to be a community.
Leviticus 8. God singles out a small group of people to do a specific work by having Moses bring together Aaron and his sons. They are washed and dressed, anointed with oils, and the area they are in is cleaned. Animals are slaughtered and cooked in a very specific manner, and the aroma fills the air. Blood from the animals is sprinkled on them, consecrating each person in this moment. They then eat together, dare I say celebrate together, spending the next 7 days with one another to mark their ordination for serving God's people. So we do now as we did then, we mark time, sometimes with pomp and circumstance, other times with a simple acknowledgement from another, or even in those times when life might have beaten us down. Each have uniquely prepared us to do things going forward. So by marking time, it launches us to doing that well, not only for ourselves, but for those in our community and the world.
Leviticus 9. In this chapter, High Priest Aaron prepares and performs an elaborate offering. First the sin offering, then the burnt and grain offerings, and then the peace offering. If it has felt tedious up until this point, it's important to remember that Aaron, the high priest, must begin with the sin offering just like everyone else. First comes the sin offering, and then, only then, can we make way for the peace offering. And it's only after the peace offering that we receive the glory of the Lord. The takeaway is pretty straightforward here, don't you think? Acknowledgement of sin, of wrongdoing, of violation is the vital first step to peace. Peace does not magically come in on a blaze of glory, but is prepared. It can sometimes feel tedious. We bring what we have to the table, including our mistakes, including the harm that we have caused. These are the crucial steps to the peace offering. Pick your modern day parallel, because this old set of instructions is still relevant today.
Leviticus chapter 10. This chapter continues the same themes of the chapter before, of God's fire showing up. Except this time it's not to show glory to the people, but rather to punish and to kill. Two of Aaron's sons carry strange, unauthorized alien fire into the tabernacle, and God's fire lashes out and kills two of Aaron's sons. This story is a scary reminder about how ancient people perceived God, that God could be holy and good and show up in these miraculous ways, as well as all-consuming and potentially deadly. Later prophets would challenge these views, and God's fire would be seen as refining rather than consuming. But in this particular chapter, we are reminded that ancient people saw God's presence as nothing to screw around with and as something to take very seriously.
Leviticus 11. These long and extremely detailed laws beg the listener to ask why. Why are some animals deemed clean, and why are some animals deemed unclean or detestable? What if this delineation between clean and unclean is rooted in a compassionate understanding of God's reverence for all life in creation? Because from how it's described, the edible animals all seem to have normal characteristics to thrive in their environment, while the inedible animals seem to be at a disadvantage or prey on the blood and carcasses of dead animals. Yuck. So could these laws be protecting the most vulnerable in creation? To have fins and scales means you can swim all around and access the resources you need. But to not have these leaves you vulnerable. And do we imitate God's holiness by preying on the vulnerable? No. No, we do not.
Leviticus chapter 12. You just had a baby. Congratulations. However, if it's a boy, you're ceremonially unclean for 7 days and then 33 days of blood purification, 40 days total. But if it's a girl, you're ceremonially unclean for 14 days and then 66 days of blood purification, 80 total days. Twice as long? What's up with that? Now, the Talmud records a conversation between a rabbi and his students where they ask about this whole twice as long if it's a girl thing, and here's what he said. When a woman gives birth to a male over which everyone is happy, she regrets her oath that she will never again engage in intercourse with her husband already 7 days after giving birth. By contrast, after giving birth to a female over which everyone is unhappy, she regrets her oath only 14 days after giving birth. Now, it's nice that the rabbi is taking into consideration the mother's feelings and experience of pain. However, it all rests on this foundation that everyone prefers to have sons rather than daughters. And really, that societal assumption, a context that values sons over daughters, boys over girls, men over women, is a root cause of a problem we are still experiencing in our world today.
Leviticus 13. The writers continue the conversation between God, Moses, and Aaron. This chapter reads like the original dermatology handbook for the Israelites. If someone wakes up with a funky rash, a terrible itch, or a bad infection, they're instructed to find Aaron or one of the priests to check it out. It seems like the work of a priest is never done. The chapter goes into the nitty-gritty of identifying skin issues, and if you have some suspicious spots showing up on your skin, Leviticus has you covered. In the interest of public health, this chapter has pointers on how to quarantine and to keep others safe from contracting a nasty disease. This chapter sounds like the biblical skincare routine you never knew you needed. The good news is, if you're losing your hair, you're clean. Mr. Clean.
Leviticus 14. And I'm not going to lie to you, it gets a little witchy. Now, this is the ritual for someone who is unclean due to leprosy and how to make them clean again. First, you take 2 birds. You take one of the birds and you slaughter it over clean water. And then you take the second bird along with hyssop, crimson ribbon, and cedar wood. And you dip it in the bloody water. And then you take the person and you sprinkle them with this water 7 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then you take a lamb and you slaughter the lamb. And then you take some of the blood from that lamb and you put it on the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right big toe of the person who needs to be cleansed from leprosy. I'm not making this up. There's even an alternative version for people that can't afford to buy a lamb. Now, there's many more steps to this ritual, but all in all, this ritual is to show that even when you're unclean, you can be made clean again and brought back into community.
Leviticus chapter 15. Masturbation and menstruation and a variety of other bodily discharges. That's what you're in for with this chapter, and while they all put you firmly in the unclean category of this clean-unclean dichotomy that we find throughout the book, it also tells us that these taboo topics are actually quite normal, with 33 verses dedicated to what to do when they happen. People masturbate, and a person with a uterus is going to menstruate. Rather than hide this reality, we need to recognize it as normal, healthy even. But zooming in, you might wonder why exactly masturbation and menstruation, these perfectly normal and natural experiences, put someone in the unclean category. Rabbis, please correct me if I'm way off on this one. Both masturbation for a man and menstruation for a woman would have been seen as the elimination of the possibility of life. Not that masturbation and menstruation are murder, but the potential spark that could lead to life is snuffed out. And as such, it makes the person unclean and in need of purification. All this to say, definitely something to think about when it's that time of the month, or the next time you find yourself,
Leviticus 16. Imagine for a moment the pure jubilance of spring cleaning, but now mix it with the horror A24 film Midsommar. That's Leviticus 16. Moses is acting as the middle manager between God and Aaron, and it's time for this fun new holiday to get slapped on the calendar, the Day of Atonement. But first, we got to kick it off by Aaron exemplifying the purification process involving 2 goats, one of which gets sacrificed on the altar, while the other gets an all-expenses-paid vacation to the wilderness to go live with some fella named Azazel. Now, who's that, you ask? We don't get to know. I'm sure they're fine. This passage highlights the fulfillment and completion of the law and prophets by Jesus in the New Testament. This barbaric and cult-like behavior may have been normative, and it clearly worked out great for Azazel, but Jesus completes the story on atonement and makes things right or at one with God. This is just the beginning of the end and a direct arrow pointing us towards Jesus' hopeful words, "It is finished." We're barely started, and better things are already being hinted at ahead.
Leviticus chapter 17. Don't sacrifice to goat demons. And definitely do not sacrifice to goat demons using rituals that involve prostitution. God tells the people that if they are going to perform a sacrifice, they must bring their sacrifice to the tabernacle. Sacrifice your offering in the presence of God, where the priest shall dash the blood against the altar of the Lord and at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord. Do not drink the blood. Blood is the life force of the animal, and we do not drink blood. God tells the people, I have given blood to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement. Therefore I have said to the Israelites, no person among you shall eat blood, nor shall any alien who resides among you eat blood. So the God of Leviticus 17 says, come closer, leave the goat demons behind, and honor the blood that represents life. Good rules for living?
Leviticus chapter 18. The Lord says to Moses, let's talk about sex, baby. Kidding, sort of. The Lord shares with Moses a long list of inappropriate sexual partners, a list directed primarily at men. No sex with your close relatives, your sister, your father's sister, your mother's sister, and your mother, because it would dishonor your father if you slept with your mother. The only prohibition for women is no sex with animals. What was going on in Egypt and Canaan? We also come across our first clobber passage, the one some folks use to keep our LGBTQ plus siblings outside the love of God. It's verse 22. Let's talk about sex for real, y'all. The Bible is not a great book in which to find your sexual mores. There's everything in here from rape to incest to polygamy. What was true for this ancient people, just finding their footing as a minority group in the world, is that they needed to distinguish themselves from all the other folks they lived among. To my same gender-loving siblings and those who want to clobber them, this is a chapter about sex. It is not a chapter about love. Don't get them confused.
Leviticus 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. This chapter is filled with so many good commandments. Some might even call it the greatest commandment. Do you see what I just did there? And really, love your neighbor as yourself captures the whole chapter. Respect your mom and dad. When you harvest, don't collect the edges, but leave it for the poor. Hey, that sounds like something we'll see later in the story of Ruth. Don't defraud people or steal from them or make them wait for their paychecks. And when a foreigner or immigrant is in your land, do not oppress them. Treat them like a citizen. Love the foreigner or immigrant as yourself. Oh, so that's the neighbor that this great commandment is talking about. Seriously, go read this whole chapter. We could still use some of these in our world today.
Leviticus chapter 20. In this chapter, laws are set or reiterated with regard to ritual purity and the prescribed punishments if they're broken. These laws are about keeping God at central place in their religious practice. The punishment for breaking these laws is harsh, swift, and meant to purge sin from the community. It's important for us to remember that Leviticus was written specifically for the people of Israel, containing laws and rules for their people to obey. At that time, a large portion of Jewish law revolved around questions of ritual purity and impurity. These laws were established to differentiate the Israelites from the people of the land they were preparing to occupy. The Holiness Code was not made for everyone living on earth. It was a specific covenant with a specific people at a specific time in history for specific purposes related to the specific situations in the land at that time. Before these texts get used to clobber one another, it's important to remember that context is everything.
Leviticus chapter 21. This chapter is all about the priests and what it takes to keep them holy. Now, when we hear the word holy, we often think it's shorthand for God, because God is holy, right? Not to be confused with holy like Swiss cheese or your dog's favorite chew toy. But the word holy simply means set apart, and that's what's going on with the priests in this chapter. These are a bunch of rules and guidelines to make sure that they are set apart. Don't touch anything defiled, no blemishes allowed, everything has to be perfect. Set apart from the norm, holy. And while there are plenty of critical readings needed in a chapter like this, specifically what it says about people with disabilities and physical deformities, not to mention degrading sex workers and any woman who isn't a virgin, we can see this chapter as a starting point for holiness. And our job is the expansive work to see that God sanctifies that which we call defiled. God sets apart that which we cast out, because to God, the bush is always burning and the ground is always holy, and perhaps we are too.
Leviticus 22. In this chapter, God sets expectations around sacred offerings, specifying who gets to handle them and even detailing the condition their bodies must be in, and the condition these offerings must be in. And I'm not going to lie, God's standard of what's acceptable and what's not makes God sound pretty ableist.
No blemishes, no scars, no deformities, etc., etc. But God gave these instructions to Moses to distinguish their worship from that of their neighbors who were sacrificing children on the altars of other gods. Today, on a daily basis, our society not only sacrifices children, but also women and the elderly on the altars of capitalism, militarism, and patriarchy. Our leaders sacrifice immunocompromised, deaf, blind, and disabled bodies on these altars to advance their own interests. Now, what would it look like to distinguish ourselves from the world and practice a worship to the Lord who makes us holy instead?
Leviticus chapter 23. These are the appointed festivals of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations: Sabbath, Passover, the offering of first fruits, the festival of weeks, the festival of trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the festival of booths. We need to mark time, move from season to season, make meaning out of our shared experiences. And while you might not have this list of holidays on your calendar, side note, holidays literally means holy days. We all have a shared rhythm that we participate in. MLK Day in January, Black History Month in February, Pride Month in June, and don't forget about Juneteenth right there in the middle, Hispanic Heritage Month in the fall, Indigenous Peoples Day, that day we used to call Columbus Day, Transgender Day of Remembrance, and then Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Festivus, Christmas, and the winter solstice. The point is, we need appointed festivals. We always have, and we always will.
Leviticus 24. The first half of this chapter tells us all about how we ought to lead lives that are pleasing to God, and the second half of the chapter tells us exactly how we can accomplish that, primarily by embodying the principle of justice. And we get this familiar line about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, listening with 21st century ears, that sounds pretty retributive. But in the ancient world, this actually ensured fairness, so that if you, say, got your eyes gouged out, you weren't responding with maybe murder. Our call in the 21st century is to continue to be a movement towards greater justice. So we get beyond retribution and maybe even move closer towards forgiveness or reconciliation or loving even our enemies, or hey, maybe even creating a world in which people aren't getting their eyes gouged out and their teeth pulled. I don't know about you, but I'd like to live in a world like that.
Leviticus chapter 25. Chances are you've heard of the Sabbath, specifically the commandment to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Well, this chapter takes it to a whole other level, as it's not just about the weekly rhythm of rest for every person, but every 7 years there's to be a sabbatical year where the land is allowed to rest. And then if that wasn't enough, the rest of the chapter lays out the year of Jubilee, the year following the 7 Sabbath years, or every 50 years. Everything is reset. Property returns to the previous owner, debts are cleared, slaves are set free. Now, there's no clear consensus on whether or not Israel ever actually celebrated this Jubilee year, but can you talk about something to aspire towards? Can you imagine the ways a year of Jubilee could upend the wealth gap caused by capitalism, the reparations still long overdue, the access and opportunity hoarded by some and systemically kept from others? Leviticus 25. Put that one on the ballot. It's got my vote.
Leviticus chapter 26. If you're righteous, everything's going to go your way. Your crops will be awesome. You won't have diseases. Wild animals won't attack you. Everything will be A-okay. If you aren't obedient, if you are not respectful, if you worship idols, then things will not go your way. Everything will absolutely fall apart. And if you are hostile towards God, God is going to be hostile towards you. Nothing will go your way. The problem with this, as I stand here in the cold waiting for my bus that's running behind, is that's not what I've seen in the world. Have you? Have you seen the righteous have easy streets and the unrighteous suffer? It doesn't always work that way.
Leviticus chapter 27. Say you want to vow your life to God, but rather than moving into the temple, you just want to make a donation. What would be the monetary value of this vow? So glad you asked. And what a coincidence! That's what this chapter is all about. If you're a 20 to 60-year-old man, it'll be 50 shekels. If you're a 20 to 6-year-old woman, it'll be 30 shekels. If you're a bit younger, say 5 to 20 years old, it'll be 20 shekels for a boy and 10 shekels for a girl. And if you're using your senior citizen discount, it'll be 15 shekels for grandpa and 10 shekels for grandma. Now, the monetary value does not denote moral worth or level of sanctity. Rather, the donation represents the equivalent value of human labor and service on behalf of the temple. But it sure looks a whole lot like the 82 cents that women make for every dollar a man makes in our world today.